deal, and so that's part of the deal. He's come here today kind of to express his gratitude and preach for us. He'll do a good job. Introduction to John will be the topic of our Bible class this morning. Just a couple of announcements. It was put on Facebook yesterday. Keely Roper had heard that, it had been reported that Dolores Trauber had been in an automobile accident, broken a couple of bones. She's supposed to have surgery, may be in surgery right now in Tyler, Texas. And so if we get some more news about where that is and when that is and what all was going on, we will report that to you as we get that information. At the meantime, we need to keep Ron and Dolores in our prayers. This coming Tuesday morning, Jerry Freeman will have heart cath, so that'll be at 7 o'clock Tuesday morning. I just have one evangelistic announcement. There'll be some people coming around today. We have got just a few little flyers left from our family vacation Bible school, and I think when you hear VBS, you think, oh, that's for kids. It's not just for kids, it's for adults too, because we have a wonderful adult class in here, and it has the plan of salvation. Those little flyers are like gospel tracts, and they promote the church. And so what we're trying to do is we got that one last Wednesday night, this coming Wednesday, that we're going to try to promote. If you could find 5 people, random people you know, it doesn't really matter. We're going to sow that seed on this community, on the people that we come in contact with, and it may be somebody will come as a result. We hope that they will. Remember that we do the watering and the sowing, and God does what? He gives the increase. That's right. So if somebody comes a Christian, it's because of that. Talking about more evangelism, we've got a tract rack out in the back, and we've got our table, evangelism table replenished. And so we've got some new gospel tracts. We've got What Must I Do to Be Saved? Can I Change? My Preacher Says is popular. And then What to Expect When You Visit the Churches of Christ. We have 4 teaching cards, and they're like the little business cards. Where will I go when I die? It's a gospel tract all in one, but then they have a QR code that they can scan and go to a video at World Bible School. The gospel enacted and reenacted, which has to do with baptism. The 10 Commandments and how those principles translate into the New Testament, and how we're not under the old law. And then, of course, God's spiritual house, the church. Wanted you to be aware of those, because if you didn't know that they were there, that evangelism table just becomes a piece of furniture, and it's not a piece of furniture. It's a resource for your personal evangelism. Now, I've been to PTP. I've just got my batteries recharged. I am totally pumped up about personal evangelism, and I'm going to be your annoyance or your good friend. So that's going to be first and foremost on my mind. And now we'll change over to, we'll have a prayer. Brett Denny, if you would lead that prayer, and then Andrew, you'll have your lesson.
Good morning. Good to see all y'all. It's been quite some time since I've had the opportunity to come down here, so good to see all your faces. Let's jump right in. So the Gospel of John. If you've done much Bible study, you're aware that there are 4 gospel accounts that we have: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And one of the questions that comes up is, why do we have 4 different accounts? And what is the reason for the differences between each of these accounts? Now, it's one of the interesting things that I have seen, and I think this is valid, is that the differences between them, even though they all talk about Jesus and they all talk about his life and They include the same major events. The differences in which details that they include reinforce the eyewitness accounts. If a detective is investigating a particular crime, a situation, and they take eyewitness accounts, they actually want to hear differences between their stories because that shows them that they didn't get together and come up with make the story up together. It shows that it comes from their own experiences and their own witness. Now, what we have going on is you've got Matthew. Now, I want for us to go through each of these 4 accounts and think about what their purpose is on an individual basis. You've got Matthew. Matthew was one of the 12 apostles himself, and it seems like he has a particular audience in mind. Who is that? The Jews. Okay. And what are some of the reasons why we say that it seems like he's writing to a Jewish audience? Okay, so he starts off with the genealogy, and he's the only one that starts off that way. Luke includes one, but he's making some different points. And when he starts off with this genealogy, he emphasizes Abraham, and he emphasizes David, and he talks a lot about messiahship, which wouldn't have meant anything to anyone else. So he emphasizes these concepts and shows how there are all these prophecies about the Messiah and how they're fulfilled. What are some other things that we see a lot of in the book of Matthew? I kind of hinted at one of them just now. We see these prophecies. Matthew does a lot of this. He'll look at something that Jesus does, and he'll say, this was to fulfill what was written by the prophet Isaiah, Jeremiah, whoever. And then he'll quote the scripture. Well, if you're quoting scripture, that only really means something to a Jewish audience. Otherwise, they're not going to have the background to understand what you're talking about. So that's Matthew. Well, now we come to Mark. Actually, we're going to skip Mark. We come to Luke. Luke is very different. And what's interesting about Luke is he's not writing for a Jewish audience, okay? Luke is writing, and he writes in the style, I'm going to give you this one. He writes in the style of a Greek biography. So unless you do much reading of Greek biographies, you might not notice that one. And who wants to sit around reading Greek biographies? I don't. So, but that's something that you can notice. And the way the Greeks would write biographies is they would look at the life of a historical figure, someone who is well respected, and they would look at all the good things that they had done, and then they'd make it into kind of a moral story. This person behaved in all these ways, and that's what made them to be a great person, so you should behave in the same ways. Okay? That's how the Greeks wrote biographies. So when you read the book of Luke, that's exactly what he does, is he looks at Jesus and says, Jesus is not just a great man, he's the perfect man. He's not just a man, he's everything that you could ever want to be. And so you should emulate everything about Jesus. And he shows all the moral characteristics that make Jesus the perfect man. Okay? That's kind of Luke's approach. So who is his audience if he's writing in this way? He's got a Greek audience, and he writes for those who are familiar with that style of writing. So you come along to Mark. Who's Mark's audience? Mark's audience is the Romans. How do we know this? What do we see within the book of Mark? There's 2 or 3 things that are really unique about Mark. I didn't have coffee either. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, so Mark does a few really unique things. The first unique thing he does is he doesn't really spend a whole lot of time on Jesus' parables or sermons. He includes some of them, But he spends a lot more time talking about Jesus' miracles and the things that Jesus did. It's known as the action-packed gospel because that's what it emphasizes. It really zooms in on Jesus' actions and what he did to help people and to heal people. And Mark writes in the present tense. You don't necessarily notice it because sometimes our translations will put it into the past tense, but he writes a lot in the present tense, which is how you tell stories, right? You might start your story and say, I was at Walmart, and I'm standing, you switch into the present tense, and I'm standing there, and I look, and I see this crazy lady with a giant pineapple hat, right? And you switch into the present tense because you're excited about the story. And that's what Mark does. He's excited to tell people about Jesus. And so he speaks in this present tense, and everything's immediately. He uses this word immediately, or in the King James, straightway. Everything happens really fast in Mark. He wants you to start the book and finish it in one reading. That's how he writes. It's a short treatise about who Jesus was. And he's hitting the Romans with this because the Romans are a lot like Americans. They live a very fast-paced lifestyle. They don't have time to sit down and thumb through books. He knows that he's got one shot at this. And so he makes it quick and efficient because he knows that's what his audience needs. Okay, so here's what I want you to think about. All right, if we're doing evangelism in the first century and we're talking to someone who's Jewish, which gospel account are we probably going to pick to study with them? Matthew. This is really easy. If I have a friend from Athens, what am I going to pull out? I'm going to pull out the book of Luke. And if I have a friend from Rome, the book of Mark. Okay. Within the first century, if you're doing evangelism and you're dividing people up into categories, you've got the Jews, you've got the Greeks, and you've got the Romans. Who's left? Well, they are the Greeks and the Romans are the Gentiles. That's pretty much everybody, right? And everyone, because of the way the culture was, everyone else, outside of even outside of the Roman Empire, people were still influenced enough by the outreach of the Greeks that you could take that approach. And if you're getting further outside, they're not speaking Greek anyway, and so bringing a Greek book to them is, it's going to take a little bit more. And so that gets into, speaking in tongues, prophecy, those other things. But as far as the first century, if you need an account of the gospel for a particular audience, you're covered. And that's what we see, is these first three accounts, there's a lot of overlap, they're very similar, and they're all written kind of around the same time in the middle of the first century. And then you have John, and John is different. John is very different. He doesn't talk about the same things. He doesn't write in the same way. He includes almost none of the same material. He writes at the end of the first century, about 30 to 40 years after everyone else finished writing. And so we ask the question, who is his audience? Okay, those in the future, past the first century? Okay, that's a good thought. What makes you say that? Okay. Those are some good thoughts. I want you to hold on to those. Any other ideas? No? No one has any ideas? Who is left? What audience has not yet been written to? Who's left out? The church. The church. The first three accounts are very, very clearly written from an evangelistic standpoint. They're introducing you to Jesus for the first time. And they're written for these audiences who were not already Christian. So, then we ask the question, okay, if John is writing to a Christian audience, why? Don't they already know who Jesus is? Here's something to remember. Here's what I want to look at. Turn to the end of John, because this is where we find out a little bit more about John's purpose in writing. We've just been talking in ideas here. I do want for us to actually look at the book and notice some things. So John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, this is where he makes his formal statement about why he's writing. He says, "Therefore, many other signs Jesus also did in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." So I'm going to upfront state, I think that's correct. I think I think John is writing to the church. That's his target audience. But if Jesus, I don't know why I keep saying Jesus, if John is writing to Christians, then why does he say, these things have been written so you may believe? Don't they already believe? That's exactly right. There's other things going on right now that are causing them to have doubts about their faith. So, if we place ourselves at the end of the first century, there's a few things going on. I would say that the persecution has maybe started, but it's actually not where it's going to get. The persecution isn't really the problem yet, but it's about to be. And he's preparing them for it. The other thing is, if you look at John's other writings, you look at 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, but especially in 1 John, John is really fighting against what we refer to as proto-Gnosticism. These ideas that were coming up in the church about who Jesus was. And there were people who believed these really strange ideas about who Jesus was. And there were these ideas that, well, maybe Jesus came in the flesh, but he wasn't really God. And there were others who said, well, actually Jesus was God, but God couldn't dwell in human flesh, so really he wasn't really there. It was kind of an apparition, a phantom sort of. It was just, he was just displaying himself, kind of like the burning bush or the angel of the Lord. And so both of these groups of people were teaching these false ideas about who Jesus was. And so when you look at John, he really hits some of these ideas right off the bat. You look at the beginning of the book, John chapter 1. The first thing he establishes is that Jesus was divine. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So he starts off, and he lays the groundwork and says, Jesus was definitely God. And we know he's talking about Jesus because in verse 14, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So he hits both of the ideas right there. Just in these first several verses, he's already hitting these major ideas. And and showing them, look, Jesus was God, and he was man. And he explains, this is kind of a difficult concept to really grasp and understand, but he puts it in very simple terms so that you really can't be confused about the fact of the matter. You can ask a lot of questions about, how is that possible? How did he do that? What does that look like? But he makes it really clear the facts. We can know and we can trust and have confidence in the fact that God came in the flesh and dwelt among men, and that he taught and lived and breathed on this earth. And so, you get to 1 John, the prologue of 1 John, and he makes some very similar statements. And there he includes details about how we saw him with our own eyes, and we held him, we touched him. And John says, I know, I was there. I was one of the apostles myself. Okay? So he's writing to combat all these strange ideas that are running through the church at the time. And he's writing to prepare the Christians for the persecution that's coming. Because if their faith isn't really strong, they're not going to be ready for this persecution. Now, what's interesting is how he does it. And I'm going to show you something, and I think this makes the book of John shine. There are 21 chapters in the book of John. And if you split it in half, it's not really in half, but we're going to say in half. At the end of chapter 12. Okay, so you've got chapters 1 through 12, 13 through 21. In chapters 1 through 12, Jesus is doing the things that we expect to see in the other Gospels. He's doing all the stuff that we saw in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where he goes around and he's teaching and he's healing, and he does a lot of interaction with the Jewish people. He also does some interaction with some non-Jewish people, which is very interesting. But that's another study that we don't have time for. So he does all this interaction with them. But chapters 13 through 21, he doesn't spend them with everybody. 13 through 21 are the chapters where he spends time with his disciples. Chapter 13 is the Last Supper, but it's told in a very different way. And you have to remember, John is telling it from his perspective. These are things that no one's ever heard before. He's writing at the end of the first century. No one has ever heard these details before. Maybe from John personally, but they're not in Matthew. They're not in Mark. They're not in Luke. Most Christians have never heard these things. And John is opening up. Before he dies, he's opening up about the experience he had with Jesus personally. So chapter 13, you have the Last Supper, and in there you actually see John refer to himself for the first time. But he doesn't refer to himself as John. What does he call himself? The disciple whom Jesus loved. Now here's a question for you. Does he ever identify who he is? Ever? No. Anyone else is interesting? There are no details in the book of John that refer to the disciple whom Jesus loved that are in any of the other accounts. So there's actually no way to pair it with John. He refers to himself in the book of John as the disciple whom Jesus loved, I want to say 4 times. I had this written down, but I don't have it in front of me. So that's some homework for you to do on your own time. But he refers to himself 4 or 5 times as the disciple whom Jesus loved, but none of those stories are in any of the other accounts. So there's actually no way to precisely identify it as John, except from kind of historical information that the early church said, yeah, John wrote this. We know it was John. Okay? So even though he refers to himself, he doesn't identify himself. Why? Why not? Wouldn't that give him a little bit more credibility? Okay, that's the first thing. It's not about him. Who's he trying to draw attention to? To Jesus. That's the first reason. I think there's a really interesting reason. I want to see if y'all get this one. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. When you read that, when you see the words, the disciple whom Jesus loved, you can say, that's me. I wasn't there personally. I didn't get to lean on Jesus and eat his last meal with him. I didn't walk along the shore with him after he was resurrected. But the words that Jesus speaks to his disciples in John, I can read them as him speaking to me. Now, I'm not saying that everything Jesus says to his apostles directly applies to us. That when he tells them, you're going to have the ability to do miraculous gifts, that applies to us. That's not what I'm saying. But here's what's interesting about John. After John 13, which is, as I said, the Last Supper, you come to John 14. And John chapters 14 through 16 is one big conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. It's one conversation. So, John doesn't spend time on any of Jesus' sermons. He doesn't include any of Jesus' sermons. He doesn't include Jesus' parables. But what he does include is he includes these conversations with his disciples. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a little bit of that, but that's why I think that's the main reason why John is writing, so he can share these conversations that he was able to have with Jesus. Now, here's what I'm going to ask you. Chapters 14 through 16. What hasn't happened yet at that point in the book? Important thing hasn't happened yet. Jesus' death, the crucifixion, right? He is standing there having a conversation with his disciples. He hasn't died yet. They don't know what's going to happen when he dies yet. So what is the purpose of that conversation? Why is he talking to them? Say that louder. To prepare them. Why does he have to prepare them? Right. So what you said and what you said. The disciples didn't fully understand or grasp what was going to happen with Jesus because they couldn't understand it. They had to wait until they saw it to really understand it. And the other thing is, when Jesus goes to the cross, their lives are threatened too. Okay? So, Jesus is having a conversation with them to prepare them. Look at some of the things that Jesus says in this section. John 14, 1 through 6. Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How do we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So he tells them, I'm going somewhere, but I'm coming back. I'm coming back. I'm going to get you. I'm not abandoning you. He's getting them ready. And what I want you to think about as we read through some of these is that John is recording these. Persecution is coming soon. And the disciples aren't ready for it. Because their faith is losing its strength. Here's another aspect of all of this. Yeah, I'll go ahead and go through this. Here's another aspect of this to think about. If we're at the end of the first century, what is there less of than there was at the beginning or middle of the first century? Miracles. Why? Because the apostles are dying off. So it's 89, 90 AD. How many apostles are left? Just John. He's the only one that's left. And if we think about the purpose of miracles, what's the purpose of miracles? Right, to bring about the word, to establish it, to confirm it. Well, everything's been written except what John has left to say. So do we need all these miracles? Not really. But here's what I want you to think about. Let's say you were a Christian, or you became a Christian on the day of Pentecost in 30 AD. Okay? You become a Christian. You move back to Sicily. I don't know. Right? You move back home. And you and some of your friends who were there, you became Christians. You start a congregation. You raise up a new generation. Let's say you start having kids. They're adults around 50 or 60 AD. Okay? Well, then they have kids, and their kids are adults around 70 to 80 AD. You see where I'm going with this? When John is writing, there are Christians who are third, fourth, and fifth generation Christians. We forget the first century was a century, right? John is writing, there are fourth generation Christians. And they haven't seen the signs that their parents saw. And if their faith is just based on these miracles and seeing these miracles, and you think about some of the older generation, well, when we were younger, we saw these miracles, but I haven't seen any signs in a long time. You think that does something to your faith, if that's where your faith came from? Jesus is talking to the disciples, and John is writing to encourage them and help rebuild their faith because it's becoming weaker. They're losing confidence. And all these ideas, it's a lot harder to tell which ideas are valid because we don't have these miracles. So John is writing, he says, there's no doubt. There's no doubt that Jesus was divine, that he did come in the flesh. Don't be fooled by all these weird ideas you hear. It's nonsense. And there's persecution coming, and I know you're not ready for it, but it'll be okay if you just follow Jesus. Okay. So when Jesus tells his disciples, believe in God, believe also in me, trust me. I'm going somewhere, but I'm coming back. It will be okay. John wants for his readers to read that and hear it. Hear it for themselves, because Jesus is gone. And he's been gone for a while. But he made a promise. And you can believe that promise. He tells them in John 15, verse 18, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll also persecute you. If they kept my word, they'll keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. But if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have sinned. But now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would not have sinned. But now they have both seen and hated me, and my Father as well. But this happened to fulfill the word that is written in their law. They hated me without cause. And when the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me. And you will bear witness also, because you have been with me from the beginning. Now we read the promise that Jesus makes of sending the Spirit to these Christians, and we're thinking about, the miraculous gifts. That's not what they're supposed to be reading when they read this. Because that's not meaningful at the end of the first century. They're living in a time a lot like our time. They're reading it with very similar eyes to what we would be reading. They're not supposed to read this and think, oh, well, it's so wonderful that we have the ability to, the Spirit just reminds us of all these things. The Spirit has done the reminding by them. The Scripture has been written. But he makes the point that the Spirit doesn't change what he says. The words of Scripture, the words that God has inspired, they're not changing. These teachings were true from the beginning, and they're still true now. At the end of the first century, in the 21st century. There are two primary ways of building faith in the book of John. Two primary ways. The first way is what? What's the first way that you can build faith? Remember what we were saying about the generations? How did the first generation build their faith? Right. They were there. They saw it. They saw these miracles and these signs. John uses the word sign. He doesn't use the word miracle. Miracle is a Matthew, Mark, Luke word. John uses the word sign. And when you think about a sign, you've got, you can have all sorts of signs. It doesn't actually have to be on a stick, right? A sign points to something else, right? You picture, a classic sign. It's got some information and then an arrow that points somewhere. That's a sign. John talks about signs. And the Greek word for sign is used the same way the English word for sign is used. So that's what he's saying. It's information, it's information that points to something else. Okay? Jesus does a sign, does a miracle. And the sign is information about Jesus. And it points at Jesus and says, this information is true about that man. So when he feeds the 5,000, it points at Jesus and shows this man has power. When he is raised from the dead, it points at Jesus and says, this man has power over death. Okay? That's a sign. So when John talks about signs, the reason he uses the word sign instead of miracle is he's pointing out it's not just a cool thing that Jesus did. It teaches us something about who he was. There's more to it than just power. Okay, that's the first way of building faith. What's the second way of building faith? There's another word that John uses quite a bit. Was that? No, that's not the word he uses. I'm being nitpicky. No, that's the same as the signs. It does talk about love a lot. They're good thoughts. They're good thoughts. I'm looking for something really specific. Okay, here, I'll give you a hint. Remember when I read John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31? He says there, therefore many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, but these are written that you may believe. Okay. What's the first word in that verse? In verse 30. What was it? And? Am I remembering it wrong? Well, okay. It's a connecting word. Mine says therefore, okay? Therefore and, take your pick. Either way, it's connecting it to what happens before that. What happens before that? What's right before that? Thomas believed because he has seen, and Jesus says what? There you go, that's the second way of making faith. Those who have not seen and yet believe. How could he have not seen and still believed? Nope, Thomas didn't have anything written. What happened?
Well, Thomas had seen and believed, but he said, blessed are they that have not seen. So the ones that have not seen, from my understanding, are those that have the Word of God.
Okay, that's where our application is going to be. But what happens in verses 24 and 25? What happens in John 20, verse 25? Someone read it. Someone read it. John 20, 25. So Thomas says, I will never believe unless... He says, I'll never believe unless I see. But he had the ability before then to believe. Why? Because he was told. And John uses a word throughout the book, a specific word, and that word is witness. He uses the word witness. You will be my witnesses. Why? Because a witness has seen something and they tell about it. And at the end of the first century, you can't do any more seeing. There's no more seeing left to do. You can't still see Jesus. It's not an option. But there are those who did see and they witnessed it. And that's why it's a little bit meta that John says, therefore, many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written that you may believe. He's saying, I'm the witness. I saw these things and I'm telling you about them. And you can have faith because I did see them. And all through the book, here's what, I know we didn't get to spend a ton of time just living in the book of John. We talked a lot about the book of John. So here's what I want you to do. I'm giving you all of this. What I want you to do is go back and read through the book of John and look for these ideas. This was a lot of ideas. Look for them. Look through the book of John and see how Jesus, he does these signs and they produce faith. And look at the witness. What happens when people witness about Jesus, when they tell about Jesus? And now my time is definitely up, so I'm going to let you go. But I hope that this benefits your future study of the book of John.